been there, I already have two of them. So
There you go, see? It's always the humans that need
Good evening, everybody. Happy New Year, right? First round table of the new year. So as you know, I always just like to say hello. I'm Dana Shope, Director of Interpretation here at the museum, and I'd like to welcome you all here. I see a lot of you are familiar faces, but some new ones, which is great. And I'm interested in the talk tonight as well. I was mentioning to Bob, well, I'm interested all the time, but particularly this one because Bob helped restore the barracks at Point Lookout. And in my younger days, I did many really fun and interesting living histories staying in those barracks, which was great. And so I've heard your name a lot. It's my first chance to get to actually meet you, so I appreciate that. So welcome again, and thanks a lot for coming, and I'll turn it over to Matt and get your meeting started.
Thank you, Dan. All right, welcome back once again, ladies and gentlemen, to the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. My name is Matt Borders. I'm the president of the Roundtable, and we have another great speaker for you this evening to kick off the new year, 2026. We're going to be looking at the prisoner of war experience during the American Civil War at one of the largest, but oftentimes not particularly well talked about prisoner of war camps here in Maryland, Point Lookout. Now, our speaker this evening has a long history with myself, actually. I've known him for many years. Bob has been a longtime volunteer at the sites right around here, particularly Monocacy National Battlefield, but he has 48 years as a volunteer down at Point Lookout, so he is really the champion of this site, a truly brilliant researcher, and a gentleman who has soon to be author. His book will be out hopefully very soon, and we're looking very much forward to having that. So let's give a big round of applause to our speaker this evening.
Thank you. Before we get started, I want to thank Matt and all of you for having me up here for the talk tonight. I had a wonderful experience today sightseeing round and round through Frederick, trying to find the museum and a couple other locations. But beautiful city as always. So, as Matt said earlier, I've been a volunteer at Point Lookout for 48 years. The book I have coming out, I've been working on it for about 13 years of writing it, and about 30 years of research. So it's being published by Savage Beatty. So I did my due diligence for Ted Savage, that's the publisher. So that'll come out soon too. Tonight, it's going to be a unique experience or a unique talk, as you see here. Hopefully, when we're done tonight, you know a little bit more, not only about Point Lookout itself, but the prison system at the time. You see from the topic, of course, the second wave. The second wave term is more of a modern historians kind of give that tag to it, but actually, it is what will happen. One thing with prisoners, of all the years' experience I've had there speaking with a lot of visitors, I get invariably I get the question that, well, you know, they were comrades in the battlefield. I mean, regardless of blue and gray, you know, they suffered equally. And why would they not treat them as well when they became prisoners of war? There was a gentleman by the name of Frank Wilkinson. He pretty much summed it up. Said, military prison, it matters not what people keep it. It's not a place where life is enjoyed. The prisoners are enemies and their keepers care a little for their lives or comfort. Nothing could be closer to the truth than this. I'm a little partial to this photograph. A lot of these guys would end up at Point Lookout, by the way. Prisoner of war. From the outset of the Civil War, the carrying of prisoners was seldom a priority for your government. Remember, the war wasn't supposed to last this long. It was supposed to be a few weeks, maybe a month or so. So the prisoner of war They actually became a nuisance for both governments and were considered the backwater of the war, but soon realized they were second armies that both governments had to provide for. With the advent of the Civil War, it was evident that neither belligerent had learned the lessons of the previous 3 wars when it came to the care and treatment of prisoners of war. Policies and regulations that govern the treatment of the prisoners continue to remain flexible, tenuous, and non-binding from the time of the American Revolution to the first shots were fired upon Fort Sumter. There were prisoners of war being taken months before the first lanyards were pulled at Fort Sumter. What do you do with them? The United States Army Regulations of 1861 state prisoners would be disarmed, receive sustenance, and then sent to the rear to be paroled and exchanged based on the orders, if any, of the general commanding in chief under the instructions of the government. And you're probably thinking, well, what's this got to do with the second wave of prisons? It has everything to do with it. Trust me, I'll give you a little background first on what we have. Colonel William Hoffman, the 3rd United States Army. Now, I'm sure everyone, or most everyone here has heard of Colonel Hoffman. At the recommendation of Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, Hoffman was appointed Commissary General of Prisoners of War in October 1861. Hoffman was a prisoner of war at the time of his appointment while awaiting the exchange. He was not exchanged until August of 1862. Now, I'll give you a little background here. He is not happy about this. There is, interestingly enough, or maybe not, there's not much written about William Hoffman. Yet, he's probably one of the most combat experienced senior officers in the United States Army by the time the war breaks out. His father was an Army officer. He was a colonel by the time of the war, 1812. William Hoffman Jr. here was one of 11 kids. He and his brother both went to the military academy. Hoffman here would graduate with Robert E. Lee, Joe Johnson, and he would, again, stay in the Army as a career. 4 of his sisters were married graduates from the West Point Academy. Very regimented life with his family. But prior to the Civil War, of course, he fought the Mexican American War, the Mormon War, the Apache expedition, both Seminole Wars. I mean, he was combat tested, brevetted twice. He came from 2nd lieutenant to lieutenant colonel in a matter of a handful of years. Been wounded several times. So even though he gets a bum rap being affiliated with the prisons, he was one brave man, very organized. And since he had the Army life behind him, in his upbringing, he was nicknamed Old Huffy because he was very strict in his regulations. And he felt that you have regulations, you should obey them. And in fact, when he goes to the academy ranked at 16th, he pretty much comes out at the same rank. And it was said that he could just about darn near recite the Army regulations. An old friend of his pre-war, of course, was Montgomery Meigs. According to Army regulations, prisoners of war came under the responsibility of the Quartermaster General, which at the time, of course, was Meigs. And he realized, I am not going to get strapped with all these prisoners of war. Secretary of War at the time was Simon Cameron, and Montgomery Meigs pointed out to the secretary, you know, you got to pick a commissary general of prisoners. I'm not going to handle them. You know what? I got a man just for you that's sitting behind the desk right now waiting for a field commander. This is the guy you want. And he recommended William Hoffman, who was outraged. He wanted to get back out into the field, but being a prisoner of war, which he still contested because he got caught up when General Twiggs surrendered the state of Texas to the Confederacy, the original government of Texas. And he joined the Confederacy and went back to Georgia. Also an Academy man, Hoffman was outraged. A fellow Academy man, stalwart general, Union Army, had deserted, according to him. In fact, so was President Buchanan. He had Twiggs' name struck from the rolls of the military academy. And so Hoffman stayed with the regiment. In fact, his regiment was posted at the Alamo, San Antonio, Texas. But he accepted his appointment to the Commissary General of Prisoners, and you can see that he resuscitated a department that had been inactive since 1815. That's almost 50 years. There was no Department of Prisoners. no commissary general. So he had no staff, no specific operational regulations, guidelines, procedures, no budget, no office, no anything. He had to start this whole system from scratch. He operated under military orders, regulations influenced by the government involving prisoner of war exchanges, transfers, releases, and recruitment of former prisoners of war. Responsible for the care of the Second Army, is what it was considered, of over approximately 220,000 prisoners of war and over 16,000 Union parolees. What most folks don't understand is he is the commissary general of prisoners. It doesn't say Confederate prisoners, it's all prisoners. So he's responsible for all those in these parole camps, as well as Union soldiers. Commissary General of Prisoners, so he was appointed by special order while he was still a prisoner of war, waiting to be exchanged. In April '62, he was promoted to colonel and transferred to the 3rd U.S. Infantry to try to soften the blow a little bit, even though he would never command the 3rd U.S. Infantry or even fall in with it in the field. General Order 67 of June '62 announced his appointment, and he reported solely to the Secretary of War, which was unusual because usually he was supposed to deposition reports to the Quartermaster General, but Meigs took care of that. He's like, oh no, you're going to report to the Secretary of War. All supervision of the prisons and prisoners came under him, and again, it included the Confederate prisoners of war as well as Union parolees. Eventually, they did give him an office. And see that if you haven't seen this photograph before, Meigs is in amongst these all his clerks there. And of course, the building is no longer there. The conference center, the Capitol rooftop view, is in its place now. It's within walking distance of the U.S. Capitol. We're on the corner of F and 20th Street Northwest in Washington. How convenient being close to the Capitol. So, I'm sure everyone here has heard of the Dix Hill Cartel. It comes out in 1862. It's the exchange cartel formulated by General John Dix, and of course, Confederate General Daniel Harvey Hill. And the exchange was very explicit on how it would be conducted. And it actually works. It works for a number of months as the war continues. Prisoners would be exchanged within 7 to 12 days after capture. But in December '62, there were approximately 5,000 prisoners in northern camps. January 1863, it drops to approximately 2,400 prisoners with 6 camps in operation. This means the exchange system is working. Hoffman closes prisons due to exchanges and releases, leaving some prisons vacant. This move would save funding for active camps. Hoffman, as well as Meigs and a lot of the other general officers who were up in age, were a product of the U.S. Army. Cut costs, robbed Peter to pay Paul. Hoffman is accused of being too frugal, starving Confederate prisoners to send money elsewhere. These are the same practices of the U.S. Army prior to the Civil War. I'm more or less giving you a shortened version of this, but it was interesting to read how these soldiers, such as Montgomery Meigs himself, of course, and Hoffman, you read in there, Winfield Scott, all these early soldiers that, and surprisingly, it was like 8 general officers that had served in War 1812 were still active. All these guys were used to dealing with a Congress that wanted to starve the U.S. Army. In other words, they had no use for the Army, and they deprived much of the expenditures to the Army. The Army had to learn how to deal with what was given to them as far as a budget. So this is where a lot of this comes into effect when Hoffman takes over the prison system. But he has some help. He has some help by a gentleman by the name of Franz Lieber. I'm not sure if you've heard of the Lieber Code, or the General Order number 100. But Lieber was a German-American jurist, political philosopher, and translator. He was also a pre-war friend of Henry Halleck, Edward Stanton, and a lot of the other high-powered lawyers prior to the war. It's always amazing how we think war was fought by politicians. There's a lot of lawyers in there. So Lieber was assisted by a select committee of military, mostly colonels and a couple of generals, and then government officials. It's commissioned by the President to create and publish regulations governing battlefield conduct in the Army in the field. After it was approved, the Libra Code became the General Order Number 100. The first modern codification of the customary law and laws of war for battlefield conduct, hailed by European nations as the first such regulations issued to an army during war. This is unusual. Usually it's post-war, and it's something called like lessons learned. This is what we learned from the last war. 33 articles of Section 3 of the Libra Code specify the basic principles pertaining to the treatment of prisoners of war. To this point, there is nothing that says how you treat a prisoner of war other than the law of nations, law of war, and what there is in Army regulations. Even though it was issued general order, most Union generals consider them more as guidelines than regulating order. Just think of General Sherman. I won't say any more after that. Here's his prison dilemma. By January 1963, Hoffman finds that the appointed camp commanders are either equal to him in rank or they outrank him. Many consider several circulars as guidelines and not orders. Stanton promotes Hoffman to brigadier general, stating that Hoffman's reports only to him and follows issuing orders to camp commanders. Any orders come from Hoffman or come from him. Now we have the year of 1863, where we thought maybe the war was going to end, but it starts to accelerate. In the beginning, Hoffman's told you're only going to need one prison, and you're going to set that up in the Great Lakes area, and he opens up Johnson's Island. But we know a few months later, he expands that. At Grant's request, Lincoln and Stanton refuse further exchanges and suspends the Dix Hill Cartel. As a result, prisons become overcrowded at an accelerated rate. Prisoners can only be transferred to the prisons as he creates new camps. Often must deal with Stanton, Grant, General Grant, Meigs, Benjamin Butler, who's now a special agent for exchange. Now I'm kind of giving you a Reader's Digest version here of what really happens. We know in July, prior to 1863, we know in mid-62, we had the Confiscation Acts. We have the Fugitive Slave Act that was part of the Compromise of 1850. We also have in March of 62 the Act prohibiting the return of slaves. This is followed by the Militia Act that now permits the federal government to recruit the formerly enslaved males as well as freedmen into the services. Of course, right after that, in September, we had the Pre-Emancipation Proclamation, followed by the beginning of 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation itself. This has all been set up to recruit and to abolish slavery and recruit the former male slaves at 16 to 26 into the federal army. Of course, the Confederate government protests, puts out a proclamation saying that they will retaliate by any former enslaved, if they're captured, even free men of color, be returned to South, returned south to servitude. The federal officers will be dealt with by individual states. Later on in July, the President Lincoln and Stanton issued a retaliation order, which basically says tit for tat. And Grant says we are not going to exchange any further if they are going to ignore our new recruits into the Army. As well, Grant finds out that after the surrender of Vicksburg, many of the Confederate soldiers he had paroled are back in the Army with that proper exchange. He's outraged. He finds this out from Port Hudson as well, where many of the prisoners that he had paroled are back in the Army now. He insists that they cease exchanges. In the meantime, Benjamin Butler, we all know very well from New Orleans, has been relieved and sent north. He wrangles the position of commanding officer of the Department of Virginia, North Carolina, which was his home base was Fort Monroe. He also retains the position of Special Agent of Exchange. So now you have General Butler, Grant, Montgomery Meigs, Stanton, Lincoln, and the one left holding the bag is William Hoffman. What do I do now? I've got all these prisoners, and they pretty much were telling him, you got to handle it. Due to the cessation of the Dix Hill Cartel, populations explode. Prisons previously closed are reopened by Hoffman. Prison numbers rise to over 30,000 by late July '63 from 2,400 a few months earlier in January. There are approximately 14 major prison camps active in the north, up from 6. He had closed many of these prisons. Active prisons became overcrowded and breakouts were feared by the northern government. New prisons are created to absorb the thousands of prisoners, increasing the population of prisons. Hoffman resorted to seek new sites and structures for prisons. You know, what a task. Can you imagine being told, you gotta go find a new place for thousands? I took a quick poll of, say, like from Chancellorsville to, say, the end of Grant's Overland Campaign. Just a sampling of a lot of major battles, maybe three campaigns. That's almost 80,000 prisoners they have taken. That's not counting all the other battles that, you know, are all in between there, all these different fights. Hoffman's now got to find a new home for all through this time. He does get a little more help in the way of Surgeon Dr. Augustus M. Clark, acting medical inspector of prisons of war, United States Volunteers. Dr. Clark was pre-war trained as a doctor. He was moved to the Battle of Gettysburg while serving as medical director of the 1st Division, 5th Army Corps, detailed to Colonel William Hoffman's department after Gettysburg. He becomes the eyes and ears of William Hoffman. He's assigned by Hoffman to inspect recently organized prisons and parole camps. He was cut from the same cloth as William Hoffman. He was very, very strict. And he had follow-up inspections. So if he told you, okay, I need you to build this hospital, and here's how you're going to do it. He came back a few weeks later and said, have you done it? And he would hold the commanding officer's foot to the fire. He recommends the organization construction of buildings and structures of during the second wave of prisons and their hospitals. He's inspected their procedures, the operations of both prisons and their hospitals, and he's also instrumental in their improvements. But I found this quote interesting, and this comes from Hoffman in a message to Clark, who had, without permission, he didn't know he needed permission, he ordered a prison hospital constructed at a prison in Rock Island, Illinois. And Hoffman came back to him and told him, as the prison camps are of a temporary character and may not be occupied for more than 2 or 3 months, or maybe a year or two, at best it must fall far short of perfection. Whatever is done should be done with a due regard to economy. In other words, we're going to do this on the cheap. But he sends Clark on all these second wave prisons that will be formed right around from July '63 on through just about near the end of the war. I point out Camp Douglas. I know everyone here has probably heard of Camp Douglas, Chicago, Illinois. What was interesting, originally it was a recruitment training camp, and later used as a prison. Then it was closed because of the Dix Hill project. Later it was reopened as a parole camp, and then that was closed, and then it was reopened as a prison. It was 20 acres, 64 barracks, 6,000 prisoner capacity, 12,000 max, approximately 30,000 were held in the 3 years there of its operation. What I like about these photographs, and my wife's not here with me tonight. She is caught whatever's going around, chest cold or whatever. But she would tell you, over the years of my research and studying these, I love these photographs. She can catch me sitting there just staring at them. I'm looking at the uniforms, I'm looking at these buildings. And if you'll notice, the soldiers in the front, Veteran Reserve Corps, Union Army, Sky Blue, the Guards, of course, Confederate prisoners behind them. And notice the buildings. These are all the early war barracks that were had multi-purposes as it was opened and closed and opened and closed throughout. You'll see these same buildings and a lot of these photographs of all the different training camps around Washington, throughout the northern states, as well as the prisons. Here we have Camp Morton, Indiana. It was closed as a prison in '62 and reopened again in '63. It was 5 acres, 2,000 prisoners of war. and so on 5 buildings, which was 4 barracks and 1 hospital. But again, notice the buildings in the background. Then we go on to July of 1863. A little spit of land in southern Maryland that kind of sticks out. The U.S. Army decided to build a hospital at the end of this peninsula, a place called Point Lookout. You might say I kind of lean a little bit towards Point Lookout, favoritism. But Point Lookout is extremely important this time of the war, and I'll tell you why. Point Lookout was designed to accommodate 5,000 prisoners of war, the possibility of expanding it another 5,000. Well, there was no possibility in a matter of months. The first August was 136. By the end of the year, 9,000 or more. That's how quickly. And almost immediately as they got there, they're building a stockade, a 12-foot stockade that you see here in the photograph. They went, Point Lookout would change its footprint 3 times because of the expansion. It was soon followed by the prisons opened in Rock Island, Illinois in November. So even though Point Lookout opens as a prison, it's not enough. But the Army hospital there is occupying approximately 150 acres. The federal government takes another 250 to accommodate all logistical support, the prison camp, and of course the guard camps there. It becomes one massive Army post. But Rock Island's not enough. Rock Island, of course, has the arsenal. It's already established there by the U.S. Army. Alton thought it was great. I got an island. I put the rest of them there. That will accommodate those being captured in the West. But then again, following July, he opens up Elmira, New York. But we go and look at why Point Lookout. It was a precarious location, absolutely. Even though Point Lookout was behind Union lines, the fact remained that it was secessionist Southern Maryland. I can, with my pointer, show you here on the map. Somewhere, pretty good. Well, maybe it's not working. Okay, right here is Point Lookout. That's a great point. To the east of it, the counties there in Maryland are all pro-secessionists. Of course, you have Virginia on this side, Virginia here. The 4 counties above it are all pro-secessionists. Why would you put a federal camp in the middle of that? They did, because it was easy to transport prisoners as well as sick and wounded in Chesapeake Bay, the Atlantic Ocean, as well as the Potomac River, with various campaigns going on in Virginia. Fortress Monroe is down here, where it was under the command again of the middle, the District of Virginia and North Carolina. It protected all the southern water approaches, and by June of 1864, it's taken away from Butler's department. It's actually given to the Department of Washington, the 22nd Army Corps, under Christopher Auger, who's in charge of the defenses of Washington, D.C. He felt Point Lookout was integral to his defenses, protecting the southern parts of that region. Again, for Point Lookout, we were talking about earlier in our earlier before the meeting, as I was talking about that the Johnson-Gilmore raid. July of '64, when Johnson was detached from Jubal Early's army to attack Point Lookout and relieve the prisoners. This threw a scare to the United States Army and to the federal government. Commanding officer at the time was General James Barnes, who was the commanding officer of the 1st Division, 5th Army Corps, who moved to Gettysburg. He also graduated with Hoffman, who was also a topographical engineer, so he was working on the defenses here. What you see here is the early and then later defenses of Point Lookout, just to show you how important Point Lookout was to the federal government. No other prison was protected like Point Lookout. At least 16 guns are protecting Point Lookout. Down here to the bottom, to the other beaches up top with the prison camp, and of course the hospital here at the bottom. It had several rifle pits that connected the 2 spits of land. It had 4 gunboats from the Potomac Flotilla, and of course the USS Minnesota. Total about 64 guns that were waiting for Bradley Johnson. And 2 companies, the 5th U.S. Cavalry, located 20 miles north, as well as 80 mounted rifles from Point Lookout that were always on patrol. Approximately 1,500 effectives that protected the peninsula itself. By December '64, there were 3 earthen redoubts that are constructed that add to the defense of Point Lookout, armed with additional 8 12-pound cannons, a total of 17 guns protecting Point Lookout. No other prison had that type of defense during the war. It's how important Point Lookout was to the government. And of course, you got 17,000 prisoners there. That's another division for Robert E. Lee. The outer perimeter, you see we have here the picket line down to the end. The whole district itself, the defensive measure was 5 miles wide by 6 miles long. Point Lookout is a massive army post. Unfortunately for Point Lookout, not many photographs exist. There were several photographers there, but very few of their photographs exist today. A lot of portraits, but as far as any kind of panoramic views, they just don't exist. What they do have is a Confederate prisoner of war by the name of John Roman Hauser, of 46 Virginia. You may have seen a lot of his color prints before in various books. You can see the temporary value of Point Lookout, the prison had. You can see how flimsy it's built, with just a few supports underneath the catwalk. This is on the Chesapeake Bay side. You see prisoners often cut hair, picking lice, probably selling lemonade, and another prisoners coming out to sell something else that they have created. You can see the structures inside the prison. The Army Corps of Engineers sent Major Charles C. Fort Stewart there, who evaluated the prison pen. He said, when he looked at it, he says, to look at the prisoners, just don't kick it over and leave. So it was that type of structure. As compared to this, Rock Island, Illinois, this is what Point Lookout was supposed to look like. This would be the standard for all the prisons as they were constructed. It was opened December '63, had 84 barracks, 25 acres, and there were 12,000 confined. And here's another one of those photographs I like to sit and just stare at. You can see how it's constructed. You see the prisoners are just as curious looking outside. We have USCT guards there walking their posts. Then, of course, Elmira Prison Camp opens in July of '64. It's another part of what they call the second wave of prison camps. Point Lookout was unique as it was just open ground, former cornfields. Prisoners said when they got there, there was just corn stalks, wild onions, marshy ground, clouds of mosquitoes and flies, and I can tell you the mosquitoes and flies are still there. But that's what they dealt with, and that's what they constructed from. Here at Elmira, this is called Barracks Number 3. It was 3 sections that was used for recruitment and rendezvous for Pennsylvania or New York troops. Sorry. As you see the tents here in the compound. At Point Lookout, the complaint was that they used tents that were unfit for the Union Army in the field. These looked fairly good shape, so they probably took what was there out of their inventory. Now, this is, again, July '64. Take note of the tree that's there and the guardhouse, the guard roost that's there on the catwalk. The next picture, just a few months later, look at the difference. How quickly you could build those barracks. They were put up quick, they could take them down just as quick. See the tree and the guardhouse there. And they were very bare bones, very Spartan, but served the purpose. It was planned to accommodate 10,000 prisoners. He held over 12,000. It was a 30-acre site and had 35 barracks. He was buying them. Now things start to accelerate even more. After the surrender of Lee's army, April '65, Grant requests a stand that all prison camps be closed. He specifically ordered Point Lookout closed in May of '65. By April 1865, according to looking at that, was supposed to be holding only 10,000. At that point, they have over 22,000 prisoners in there. We look at it, released over 18,000 prisoners during the month of July alone. Kind of on the, I'm going to add to this, if you've ever read the book, The Ends of War by Carol Janney, I highly recommend that. See what actually goes on after Lee's surrender. The thousands of Confederate soldiers that are still in the field yet, that are still roaming the area. And those that Lee surrenders at Appomattox, where they go. This is interesting. And as in all soldiers, particularly with the returning Confederate prisoners, the returning former prisoners were labeled as coarse, distant, profane, and distrustful of everyone. They're prisoners of war. The cause was lost, their lives were changed by 4 years of war. The South was devastated. Slavery as they knew it no longer existed. The states were occupied by former enemies. Many succumbed to alcoholism, opioid addiction. Suicide among former Southern soldiers was near epidemic. The Commissary General of Prisoners officially ceased to exist on November 3rd, 1865. Thereafter, its records were transferred from the Quartermaster Department to the Adjutant General's office in Washington, D.C. In the final accounting after the war, General Hoffman returned approximately $1.8 million to the Treasury, which is equal to about $34.8 today, in savings from the prison fund allotted for prisoner subsistence. Just to give you an idea of what Hoffman had to deal with when he created the system. And then it accelerates in July of 1863 from one to many. Hoffman creates and is responsible for 32 primary prison camps, 6 Army hospitals, and several Union parole camps. 18 were second wave camps. 18 of those that he created, that of 32, were second wave camps from July 63 to just prior to 1865. 9 were major prison camps. Over the course of the war, there were approximately 180 prisoner holding areas north and south. Of that number, 98 were Union prison camps and sites that he was responsible for. That's a lot. That's quite a bit. Again, here we're back at Camp Douglas. But General Hoffman he goes into obscurity after this. Brevetted Major General for service as Commissary General. He's relieved as Commissary General November 3rd, 65. He commands a regiment, St. Louis, Missouri. He's posted in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas from 1866 to 68. Superintendent of General Recruiting Services, March 68 to April 69. And he retires to Rock Island from the Army in 1870 as colonel after serving 41 years. In retirement, he and his second wife started school for girls, and he dies August 12th, 1884. He's buried in Rock Island. What's interesting about William Hoffman is that basically there's nothing written about him. He did lead an army in the field, even though he did build fortifications out west like Fort Bridger and other Indian posts out there prior to the war. And he did serve with distinction prior to the Civil War. But during the Civil War, he really didn't do anything spectacular like leading in the field or fighting any battles and so forth. In fact, probably the one, any kind of authoritative writing about it was done in the 1970s by a gentleman with the last name of Hunter who decided to do his PhD dissertation on Hoffman. And he did a lot of writing on him, he dove into the archives and so forth, but even the descendants of Hoffman didn't have much information to give. He really didn't leave a whole lot behind. He had, I believe he said, just a daughter, and she didn't have much to pass along either. So it's remarkable that someone who was responsible for the system and did so much for 4 years of war, and then what he did prior to the war, there's just nothing about him. But it wasn't for naught. Lessons learned from Hoffman's prison system. This is post-war. The improvement in the general treatment, welfare, and care of prisoners. Prisoner identification, improved record keeping. Advancement in prisoner registration regarding their deaths and grades registration. The Lever Code, General Order 100 of April 63, that contained 157 articles, was reissued in 1889, influenced the Geneva Convention of 1864 and the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. They used the Lever Code as the basis for their legislation and codification of the international laws of war. That's very significant. This is global at this point. And I've included those that like to look at statistics. Statistics are interesting, very fluid. But here you have 462,000 Confederate soldiers captured, 248 paroled on the field, 220 were prisoners of war, 211,000 Union soldiers captured, almost 17,000 paroled, and 126,000 of those were made prisoners of war. Historians in the post-war years classified prisons into 7 categories. This just gives you an idea of also what Hoffman had to deal with, what he had to go find, what he had to go create. He used local jails, prisons, penitentiaries, masonry forts, existing buildings used as commercial warehouses, enclosures surrounding barracks constructed for camps of instruction, undeveloped areas enclosed by stockades where prisoners were provided tents, open stockades where prisoners were placed in secure shelter, open barren fields used as temporary holding areas. Point Lookout is classified in the 5th category. Prisons constructed at Point Lookout, Parks Island, New York, Camp Butler, Newport News, Virginia, Johnson's Island, Ohio, and Rock Island, with a few prisons constructed whose sole purpose was only to incarcerate prisoners. In other words, everything else had been used as forts, warehouses, and so forth. When the prisons were beginning to fill up to beyond capacity, the commanding officer of one of the forts that were on one of the islands in New York Harbor actually complained to Hoffman that he had so many prisoners jammed in the fort that actually negated the defensive purpose of the fort. In other words, I can't defend the harbor if we're attacked. I got Confederate prisoners on the casemates and everywhere else. So you got to deal with them somewhere else. Before the Statue of Liberty was built, they was called Fort Wood. That was also a prison holding area as well. Many of the prisons, as opposed to say battlefields that have artillery and signs and so forth, are rightfully so, marking how the battles was fought. Prison camps went into obscurity. They were entities people didn't want to remember. They refused to recognize they existed. I know when I first started so many years ago down there, people would ask me, some of the locals, why do you want to preserve that? We just assumed Point Lookout was sank in the water. That's the 1970s, like early 1980s. I would mention that, there was this massive Army hospital down there. I mean, it is like 150 acres. There were some people that refused to acknowledge it was even there. That Yankee prison was there. Well, yeah, they remember that part. You mentioned Point Lookout, that's what pops at first, is you remember that prison. Of course, Andersonville exists. They got the press. Whoever wins the war writes the history, of course. So Andersonville with the National Park Service, it's very well interpreted. They've gone beyond that if you haven't been there before. The Prisoner of War Museum, and so forth. Some other places that were prison camps in the second wave are also starting to begin development. Sadly, the one thing that does remain from a lot of these prisons that stand out are the cemeteries. Of course, here at Point Lookout, there's an exact copy or replica of this monument over in Finn's Point, near Fort Delaware. Same company constructed the monument there. You go to Elmira Cemetery, Woodlawn Cemetery. Any prison camp that exists usually has their cemetery still there. Elmira has a friends group now. They're starting to interpret their site. The building on the right is a construction of the small barracks buildings we were showing you in the other photographs that we had there. The building on the right, the tall gray one there, somebody actually bought that building from the government. After the war was over, and they sold these buildings for salvage because they needed a lot of money back in the coffers. Somebody bought that building there on the right, took it apart, stacked it up, and forgot about it. Somebody found it a handful of years ago and actually reconstructed the building there on the site of the prison, and then they reconstructed the barracks there you see on the left. They just broke ground for a big visitor center there, so they're on the upswing to interpret that area as the prison. Fortunately for us at Point Lookout, we do have Fort number 3. This is the only earthen fort that remains in the state of Maryland from the war, especially in this condition. The buildings this is 3 of our 4 buildings that were reconstructed according to the plans. You see these same buildings in those photographs. You'll see the same buildings in the circular forts around Washington. Very cookie cutter, we say. This is the inside of our barracks, reconstructed from the plans. And we just completed $8,500 grant reconstructing our prison wall there at Point Lookout on the site where it stood. We added 18 new interpretive signs there in the park. This is the new one we placed in the prison. And our most recent is at Marking Hammond Hospital, there by the lighthouse. There was a writer, Dr. William Heseltine, who was one of the forerunners, writers writing about Civil War prisons. He had a book entitled Civil War Prisons. It was a series of essays, one by Dr. Robinson, actually wrote Owen Elmira. But I like the back cover of his book. He left a saying for us there. The student of the times must pick his way carefully among the passionate and partisan documents of the era in order to arrive at a true picture of the prisons north and south, how they were administered, what life of the captured soldiers was like. This is very true. This is very true with everything today, that all the research that we do for the war, the soldiers. The second wave of prisons, again, that's a modern term that historians have given it, but for a war that was supposed to end soon, of course, this is what the United States had to deal with, as well as the Confederacy. At least the United States government had a Commissary General of Prisons, even before he was released from his parole. The Confederacy finally has a Commissary General in November of '64, General Winder. Generally, the state's provost marshals would handle prisoners of war. But that being said, in conclusion, thank you for having me here. We could probably talk another whole day just about prisons alone. I gave you a very short synopsis of what these guys had to deal with. We could talk hours on rations, clothing issues, political issues particularly, and how they affect the prisons. President Lincoln had visited Point Lookout a couple of times to see the conditions. When they had the meeting, if you're familiar with the movie Lincoln, they depict in there when Lincoln met on the River Queen, a little Hollywood license there, but still they depicted that where during one of those meetings when they couldn't agree, when President Lincoln told Alexander Stephens, no, you need to surrender. The war's over. Of course, Stephens didn't agree. When he got up to leave, he said, if we can't agree on anything else, can we do something for the prisoners? And thereafter, Lincoln had ordered General Grant, let's continue with the exchange system, which reinstituted again in January of '65. But in my research, I found that there were exchanges still going on from September, October, November, December of 1864 through General Butler. He was exchanging prisoners. Point Lookout was considered a point of transit. They had prisoners going north, going through Point Lookout. They had prisoners going south constantly through Point Lookout. So if you look at the population rates, the head count, monthly, it goes up and down like you wouldn't believe. So, and I have one more thing. My publisher asked me to ashamedly advertise myself. So I'm doing my due diligence on my new release. But I've been researching 30 years. It took me 13 years to write this. I worked really hard with this. My wife said, if he's not home working on Point Lookout, that means he's at Point Lookout. She calls it my second zip code. But as you can see here, it's 384 pages, and it's 34 images. I have a lot of information that's been published before about Point Lookout, as well as photographs, and of course 5 maps and so forth, as it says there. So, do we have time for questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yes, sir.
How close is the hospital located to the resident camp or grounds?
And here at Point Lookout?
Yeah,
This is a good generalization, but it's at least a quarter mile. This is not the final footprint of Point Lookout. This is right around February, March of 1864. They actually had a third section to this. And if you notice, I'd say the Civil War's largest prison, not largest prison of the North. It actually tops out at about 45, 46 acres when they had the third section. Once they put that down there, it's maybe less than a quarter mile distance from the hospital. They're very close in relation distance-wise. So, this is one massive army post.
did it continue to be used after the end of the war? The hospital?
When the hospital, let's see, so I'll give you a short answer. Yes, it was supposed to be used as a soldier and sailor's asylum after that. Once the prison was closed, they were knocking down all the buildings, putting everything back into the system. A lady, a philanthropist by the name of Delphine Baker, actually purchases this part of the point, and she wants the hospital to be used as a soldiers and sailors asylum. The board is made up of one of the former commanding generals of Point Lookout, Benjamin Butler's on there, and some influential politicians. But they decided that it would be improper and more or less a slap in the face of those brave Union soldiers being here in a hospital near a prison that had held their enemy. So they decided not to put it there. So after that, then it was turned. But we're talking about another year or so after the war was over. Yes, ma'am.
What constituted a parole? I mean, was it just to move the men out so they could make more men, or was it just, picking certain groups of men? I'm sure somebody wasn't sitting there and looking at, each of these men. Or is that hard to say?
That's, we could spend a lot of time talking about that one too. There was, at the end, you had the oath of allegiance and amnesty, where you had to take parole until, basically you were released, you were staying. Then there was the parole of honor, which is basically what they did at Appomattox, saying, you go home, but you got to wait until you're exchanged. What constituted at Point Lookout, there was no rhyme or reason. There in the prison pen itself, there was a bulletin board. And these guys checked it constantly because there were lists on there. It says all the guys who were captured July 1st at Gettysburg, have your stuff ready to go and we'll be exchanged.
So that's what
Everybody whose last name begins with A. Of course, one guy said it's amazing how many guys had the last name begin with A that show up. There was no real rhyme or reason. It's always been a real head scratcher how they determined. There was cases I read where the clerks needed 500 bodies. I got 500 bodies. I don't care how long you've been here. There were guys that were there just a few days, a few weeks, a couple months. Then there was those a year and a half.
I mean, and you couldn't identify them. They probably didn't have any type of papers to even say,
No,
where
there
they
was no retina IDs, no thumb IDs, nothing. You were taken at your honesty. And if you passed away, I hope somebody knows your name. A lot of times they would just call them by their states. So that's what I say with prisoner identification really becomes a factor after that. So, yes, sir.
Me?
Yep.
These were enlisted men at the at this prison, correct?
I'm sorry,
Were they all enlisted Confederates?
No.
There were officers too?
absolutely. The lithograph here, you'll see an open pen just south of there. The reason why it's open, that's how I can time date it. Most of the officers that were coming in at Point Lookout were paroled and were kept here near Hammond Hospital.
Okay.
There was no place to put them, because you can't put officers in if you're enlisted men for obvious reasons. So they built this prison, the additional stockade, and they moved up there in March of '65. But it was discovered that they were planning a mass breakout. You'll notice there's like an alleyway in between there. That was another guard beat. They found out that they were organizing. They were tying notes to rocks and throwing them over the walls, back and forth to each other. Well, one evening, one landed short in that little alleyway, right where the guard was going by. He picked it up, read the note, and got to headquarters really fast. And what they were hearing rumors of became a reality, that they were organizing for a mass breakout. They were looking for an excuse to get rid of to move the officers. They actually do. June of '64 is about 650 of them were all moved up to Fort Delaware, which opened as 10. The bottom corner here, the prison. This is the prison hospital. It was a swamp. What they did is they knocked one wall down, they incorporated that prison in with that one, and then they made that the prison hospital down here. But that was entirely all enlisted men. That was their fear. So what they did, when they found out about that, was that they emptied the prison. They took everybody out of there. The guards went in, they ransacked the entire prison. They supposedly found bundles of Union uniforms, 2 boats that would take a number of bodies. They found 75 rifles and other.
Where'd they get that stuff?
Well, that was a question that
Yeah.
several of the higher rankers were all wondering about. But then someone came up with a solution in New Hampshire. At the time, when the first guards and prisoners came to Point Lookout, it was about 300 men of the 2nd Assault New Hampshire and 136 prisoners. The 5th New Hampshire was sent back to New Hampshire to receive new recruits. This is November '63. So remember what's happening in July '63, the draft. So now they're going up there to receive recruits, draftees, and substitutes. They said they basically had to guard the entire contingent to bring them down there. Even then, a lot of guys deserted. Some of the guards complained that they had more guards in their own camps than they had on the prisoners, just to keep these guys there. So they felt that some of these deserters or some of these substitutes really hated the American government as much as the guys they were guarding. So there were times where prisoners talked about gunfire at night, and during the day on the beaches they would see both blue and gray bombs. So, but that was a big scare. Now the prison authorities had Union guards there dressed as Confederates. They had them embedded in the population just to hear the ferret, a lot of tunnel operations and so forth. But, yeah, they finally removed. The officers that came in after that were all held down here at Hammond Hospital area. So. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Weren't they using black dogs towards the end of the war?
The first USCTs come in right around April of '64. It was the 4th USCT. They were there when the 2nd, 5th, and 12th New Hampshire were still there. They were there a month. And then the 36th USCT, a whole full regiment, 30,000 of them, formerly the 2nd North Carolina, they came in right around February of '64. They left in July of '64 and replaced by the 5th Massachusetts Colored Cavalry. They came in and they were there till March '65. So there was always a USCT presence there, just barely a few months after the first guards arrived. If not, thank you for having me. Skip around a bit because it's quite hard to talk about. When you talk about like the Battle of Gettysburg, 3-day fight. Here you're talking 3 years of history. So, a lot goes on.
So again,